what do you mean by creative leadership? And on the next slide, we have two definitions of creative leadership. One of them is in the book, which is the first one, and the second one is actually part of a revision of chapter 1 that Gerard and I were talking about on Thursday. And I had it circled and I said, wow, I really like this as a very practical definition of creative leadership. And I mentioned it to Mary, but the three of us have never
talked about it yet.
haven't talked about it yet. So this is like hot off the presses. You know, the first definition, you know, looking at all of the different elements, you know, the process, the, you know, environment and all of that. But yet, when Gerard and Jeffrey Zacko-Smith and I went to a conference in Indianapolis, and we presented on the concept of creative leadership, one of the presenters there talked about global leadership. And what is it that prepares a person to actually go out into different environments and to be effective as a leader? If they're here in the US being a leader, can they just go over to India and be a leader effectively? And what they studied was, what are the competencies of a person who's very successful culturally as a global leader? And so we started thinking about that positioning as we look at leadership, the big piece. And then there's this thing that they've sort of carved out that is global leadership. And what we're saying is we're carving out this piece that's creative leadership, that's like a subset of leadership. And so that's kind of where some of our thinking, and I just went, whoa, I like this definition, and maybe we ought to think about using that as our definition of creative leadership. So I don't know if you and Mary want to make any comments about that off the cuff, but it went, wow, it had a wow factor to me.
Yeah, well, I'll make a comment about the writing process. I think we're very fortunate that as part of our responsibilities in academia, and Mary mentioned this as well, we're charged with being thought leaders. And the writing process, I know what it does for me is it gives me an opportunity to really kind of test my thinking, to test my ideas. So as I write, you know, often I'll go, oh, that's rubbish, that doesn't make sense, you know, it doesn't hold up, delete. And other times you get to really, it's like a sculptor, really craft the object that you're working on. In our case, it's, you know, our objects are concepts. And by committing it to writing, let's face it, when you're talking out loud like I am right now, it can be really sloppy in your thinking. But when you're writing, because it's fixed, it has to be really cogent and coherent. And what the writing process, I know for me, and I think also the fact that as an authorship team, the wonderful thing about being an authorship team is that we get to give specific feedback on each other's thoughts because we see it committed to well, I can't say pen and paper, but electronically to computer. And so in thinking about the second edition, one of the chapters that is going to go through the most serious revision is the first chapter, because of our experiences and the feedback that we've received. And Marie mentioned Dr. Jeffrey Zacko-Smith, who has joined the faculty, who primarily came on board because of his background in leadership and as a coordinator of our undergraduate leadership minor program, and working with Jeffrey, who's joined this initiative. We're really saying, gosh, can we really carve out, does the concept creative leadership hold up in, you know, in the broader study of leadership? And I think that we're moving in that direction of saying, yes, it definitely does, and it's a particular kind of leadership. And thus, that's the second definition. That's the working definition right now. Creative leadership is deliberately engaging one's imagination to define and guide a group towards a novel goal, a direction that is new for the group. And so the essence there is what creative leadership is about is helping to move a group. When we say a group, it could be a unit, could be an organization, could be a community, could be society, specifically in a new direction. So that's a subset of leadership, because you can think of situations, and it's not, well, it's very common to describe leadership as helping people to move towards a meaningful goal. So an Army officer who's helping his troops take a certain objective, take a hill, you would say that person is exerting leadership, certainly. It's a known goal, it's a known outcome that they're moving towards. That's not the kind of leadership that we're talking about. We're talking about the kind of leadership where you're intentionally introducing novelty. You're moving in a new direction. And we think that takes a particular kind of skill set to do that.
Okay.
I like
Okay,
it.
all right, yeah.
You know?
Mary, did you want to comment on?
Because I think it really targets in more effectively on those aspects that you just described that are related to the creative part and what makes that different. So it's some element of newness in some kind of way. It's the bottom line of what creativity is all about. And I also like the use of the word imagination in this as well too, because it opens up another skill set. It's not that those things aren't there, but it helps to make them more explicit.
And I actually revised it this morning.
Whoa,
Let's hear.
hot off the presses.
So the current working version in my mind is, I just added some pieces. So creative leadership is deliberately engaging one's imagination and others, because the importance of engaging others' imagination as a leader to define and guide a group towards a novel goal, a direction that is new for the group, organization, or society. So just kind of elaborate on what we mean by group. So.
Now, what I like about that is that it adds that influencing piece back to leadership again, back to a bottom line definition that most people will agree with, and what a characteristic of leadership is. It's some kind of influence that shows on other people and on what goes on.
Yeah.
I think that's a good addition.
Talk about some of the models that are in the book and how they're changing, and at least one new model that we're going to include in the book. So one that was included in the first edition is this model that talks about the kinds of problems that leaders work on. And the reason why we put this in the book was to zero in on specifically the kinds of problems for which creative thinking and creative problem solving might be applied to. So those of you who are sitting here are all familiar with this model. So it's a 2x2 matrix where on one dimension, the x-axis, we have how you approach the problem. In some cases, we react. Something occurs, it presents itself to us, and then we have to respond to it. We have to do something to successfully resolve that situation. Another kind of approach to a problem is where we intentionally decide to be proactive, to leap ahead, to engage in forward thinking. On the y-axis, we have the kind of problems that you might work on, and those break into two sorts: algorithmic, which is there's a known process and a predictable outcome, and heuristic, which is open, completely open. There's not a set process or procedure to follow, and we're not sure what the outcome is going to be. We don't have a solution in mind. So when you cross those two, you get 4 areas. You have formulaic problems, maintenance problems, predicaments, and opportunities. Now, the new thinking around this, we'll get to in a moment. I'm actually going to hold off on that. Let me give you some examples. So, formulaic, which is you're reacting to a situation, you have a known process, you're going to get to a known outcome. So, let's say you're a teacher, and you have a particular lesson plan. It's been successful in the past. It achieves the learning objectives that you want. You've got a new grade or a new class of students coming in. You repeat what you've done in the past. It's not broken, so why mess with it? It works. In an organization, you have an event. You put it on every year. This happens at Buffalo State. So rather than reinventing the wheel, Reinventing the process every year, you simply repeat what you've done in the past, and you get the same outcome. That's what we mean by a formulaic problem. Example of maintenance problem, so here's where you're being proactive, you're anticipating that something's going to occur, and if you don't address it up front, then it's really going to be problematic. So for teachers, at the end of the summer, students, they go home, or they're not involved in summer school. There's a little bit of drop-off in reading or skills. So often you spend the beginning of the school year doing what? Getting students back to where they were. That's maintenance. So you're doing something to get back to a certain level of proficiency so that you can then carry on. If you don't change the oil or lubrication in a piece of machinery, you know that down the road it's going to lead to bigger problems. So you engage in maintenance. You proactively do something to stop that from occurring in the future. Now here's the new piece. Jeffrey Zackler-Smith, Marie, and I were invited into a class that Sue, you invite us into a lot of your classes.
Hey, works great.
Yeah, I'm going to have to adopt that strategy. So we were invited, actually it was a nice opportunity for us last spring to share some of our thinking before we went off to the conference that Marie mentioned at Indiana University. And one of the students asked, what do you call a leader who's not creative? And I immediately blurted out, a manager. Yeah, and all the air in the room got immediately sucked out. Ooh, that's really pejorative. That's really judgmental. And so I started reflecting on that, and in the first edition we talked about the differences. It's a classic way of defining leadership is to contrast it to management. Since the 70s in Harvard Business Review with Zalesnik and his article on leaders versus managers. I don't want to personalize. I don't want to talk about managers and leaders. I'm going to talk now about management as a behavior set and leadership as a set of behaviors. And so in reflecting on this, what occurred to me, and Mary and Marie and I had a lot of conversation about this afterwards, when you look at formulaic and maintenance kinds of problems, you're engaged in the process of management because you're trying to sustain things as they are. And that's really important. Organizations need that efficiency and repeatability and predictability and so forth. The new insight, building on that, is that there are times when you need to engage in creative management. And that's when you're faced with a predicament. So for example, you're an organization, you make food products, and during the recession, commodities like soybeans become much more expensive. You don't want to raise your prices because you're in a recession, but you want to maintain your profitability. What do? That's a predicament. That requires creative management because you have to apply imagination to sustain current levels of profitability. So what was interesting for us was, gosh, that this pejorative creativity is solely related to leadership, and you see this in the literature, management is strictly about maintaining the status quo, is a bit restrictive. It's too narrow because there are times when you are managing a situation where you really need to use your imagination. And then creative leadership, as Marie was referring to, and Mary as well, specifically focuses in on that being proactive in an open-ended situation. So it's saying, okay, going back to that organizational example, we know that looking into the future, there will be certain opportunities in terms of looking at demographics and trends. So let's be innovative. Let's create some new products. Let's create some new directions. I heard on the radio this morning driving in that Warren Buffett just purchased the largest railroad company in the U.S. Now, why did Warren Buffett do that? Because he's looking at the trends. He sees what's happening with energy. He realizes that trucking may be a dying industry. When you can move a ton of freight 400 miles on 1 gallon of gas in the railroad sector, that provides a certain opportunity. And so what creative leadership is about, and Mumford talks about it, is forecasting and looking based on trends, being proactive and saying, spotting opportunities. And we see that creative problem solving is useful for leaders both in terms of wrestling with predicaments and also seizing opportunities. And then that brings us to another model. I've been using this model in the work that I've been doing a lot at Rich Products and other environments where I'm working with managers, and we're dealing with the topic of creative leadership, and they have found this to be very useful, and I've gotten very positive feedback on it. So we're thinking about putting this into the second edition of the book. So 3 concepts that we want to connect, and this relates to our systems model. But specifically focusing on creativity, leadership, and innovation, and what's the overlap among those 3. Maria already talked about it. It's change. So creativity is a process that when we engage in creative thinking, it leads us to a change, to a new insight that hopefully when it gets adopted is going to introduce change. Leadership is a catalyst for change. We look to leaders, or people take on leadership behavior so that they can help bring about, so they can help drive change. Innovation is the successful adoption of change inside of an organization or in a marketplace. So change, we see change in all 3. So that's the genetic connection among the 3. Now, what's the overlap? Nice thing about Venn diagrams, as this model is depicted in the form of a Venn diagram, we can then look at the overlap. So John Carver and I wrote a chapter recently where we talked about organizational creativity, and we're not the only ones who make this argument. Teresa Mabile has made the case for this as well. You don't get innovation unless you have creativity first. A lot of organizations talk about, we're going to be innovative. It's in their mission statement. But they don't do anything to promote creativity. So without that, because creativity is the production of new and useful ideas, you don't get to generate and result in bringing innovation to fruition. What's the overlap between creativity and leadership? The case that we make in the book is that creative problem solving is a fundamental core leadership skill. What's the overlap between leadership and innovation? We see, and there's work by Jorn Ekval and Michael West that talk about leadership having a profound impact on innovation by creating a climate or a culture that promotes innovation. I was reading a study, Boston Consulting Group, a few years ago, 2007. Number 1 barrier, according to 2,500 executives around the world, to innovation in their organization, number 1 barrier is risk-averse culture. And we think that leadership has a lot to do with setting the tone and creating the culture that allows for innovation to occur. So that's a model that we'll probably be presenting in the second edition as a way of helping the reader understand how we're connecting creativity, leadership, and innovation.